For those who don't know, I'm Dave McRae from the University of Melbourne. As Dirk mentioned, it's our great misfortune that Jacqui Baker, who was to speak on security sector reform in this session, has taken unwell. She's very kindly prepared a 3-minute summary of her presentation that I'll read out after our first speaker, Stephen Sherlock, speaks for us on the Balancing Act, Presidency, Cabinet and Parliament during the SBA years. Stephen, I'm sure, would be familiar to many of you through his writings on the workings of the DPR, political parties and elections in Indonesia. He's currently a visiting fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change at ANU, having previously been director of the Centre for Democratic Institutions. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Dave, for that introduction. Now, you might notice that the title of my paper is different from the one in the program. It's not that I've changed the content at all, it's just thinking about different ways that I might present the material in there. The first title was really the subject of the discussion here. The second title is dealing with what is perhaps the thematic treatment of the material. That is that we're asking the question, given this presidency that SBY stepped into as an individual, the institution of the presidency, moving away from so much of the personality-focused discussion that we've just come from, given that the realities of that institution and the fact that Indonesia was now a multipolar democracy, many, many different centres of power, rather than being centred on the president as it had been, how did SBY respond? What strategies did he follow to deal with the situation that he walked into in 2004? All right, there's a number of themes of this paper, or perhaps theses of the paper, that first, that the post-2004 Indonesian presidency was without historical precedent. And that's something I don't think is understood by many, many analysts, and it's certainly not understood, I would argue, by the Indonesian political class. I'll explain what I mean by that as I go along. And despite the newness of the situation that SBY faced, his Rainbow Cabinet strategy of dealing with that was exactly the same as his predecessors, despite the changed circumstances. And his consensual approach to government produced very little progress in dealing with the realities of the new Indonesian presidential system in terms of informal approaches and in terms of the basic mechanisms and machinery of government. Especially, and this is the main theme of my paper, executive-legislative dynamics. Another theme that I want to deal with, another argument that I make, is that the emphasis on the putative obstructionism by the DPR, by the Parliament, that is a sub-theme of a lot of the analysis of the SBY years, is, in my opinion, mistaken. And in fact, there is a very complex, we need to have a nuanced understanding of the mixture of influences on legislation and policy, and in particular, the continuing central role of the bureaucracy in policy making, particularly as it's embodied in legislation. And then finally, a few observations about SBY's legacy, a legacy which is perhaps a legacy of absences, things that didn't happen that might have happened. All right, first of all, I think it's important to understand the historical context of the Indonesian presidency. What was the historical baggage that SBY carried with him into the Istana in 2004? And I was struck by this quote from Baswedan in 2007, that an important and enduring feature of Indonesian politics has been the dominance of the president, and that Indonesia's first two presidents set a precedent for the role and stature of their successors. They created a huge baggage of presuppositions and expectations about what the president would do and the role that he or she could play in politics. First of all, of course, we need to understand that the 45 Constitution was very much centred on the president. It was, of course, an interim constitution. There were plans for later change. The assumption was not, I think, that the president would play the dominating role that he did end up playing, or that the office ended up playing. And that was reinforced by the perceived failure, and I say perceived failure, whether it was a failure or not is a moot point, but the perceived failure of the parliamentary system from 50 to 59 reinforced this idea that only a dominating individual personality in the office of the presidency could progress the country. And of course, Sukarno reimposed the 45 Constitution in 1959. And then from then on until 1998-99, the president was the dominating figure. The office of the president was dominant, the figure, the individual of the president was also dominant. But in 1998, as Harold Kraut put it in his book in 2010, the disguised quasi-parliamentary nature of the 1945 Constitution was revealed. That even though people thought of it as a presidential-based constitution, if it was allowed to work in a way it perhaps it should have worked, according to theory, it was in fact a disguised quasi-parliamentary system. Because the president, of course, was elected by the parliament, by the MPR. But for 40 years, that MPR was a rubber stamp. But after 1999, the MPR, the DPR, the parliament was now a truly representative body. It was no longer a rubber stamp. The president needed to maintain a majority, to maintain his or her government, to have his or her policy agenda progressed. That led to the crisis around the removal from power of President Abdurrahman Wahid. Now, it's one of these, ironies of history. Interesting, given the previous discussion, that individual who stepped into that set of circumstances was probably the devilishly most unsuitable person to do that. He was a person who, it seemed, was incapable of successfully maintaining a good relationship with the parliament. He seemed to almost enjoy antagonising the parliament. And it's interesting to speculate that had that not occurred, the process of constitutional reform might indeed have been different, but who knows. But there was a recognised need to clarify the powers, the relative powers, the balance of powers between the executive, the presidency, and the legislature, the DPR. That led to the period of constitutional reform from 1999 to 2002. So what was the presidency inherited by SBY? As I've mentioned, he inherited a huge number of historical assumptions about what the president should do and what the presidency should do, and expectations of his predominance in politics. But I would like to argue that it was a combination of relationships that in fact were without historical precedent. Despite the fact that he came with a whole lot of expectations, he was actually in a very new set of historical circumstances. It was a combination of now Indonesia having a conventional presidential system, such as the classic model being in the US, of two separately elected branches of government with separately defined powers, unlike this quasi-presidential system or the complete domination of the president, which had characterised previous Indonesian history. In combination, of course, with the democratic environment. The democratic environment was something which was one of the legacies of Gus Dur and Megawati, but they were in different constitutional circumstances. SBY, on the other hand, was in this historically unprecedented situation. And he had to deal with empowered political parties, new political competition, and the power of an enhanced and now legitimate DPR. Multi-party elections in 1999-2004 led to a very unclear balance of power. No party in Parliament really predominant. Also very important was the recent history of unstable relationships under Gus Dur and then in the downfall of President Suharto. And I think it's easy now to forget how bruised and traumatised people in Indonesia were in 2004. That was a relatively short time that all of that turmoil had happened. So there was a lot of uncertainty and a desire for a period of stability. And that, I think, particularly influenced SBY's thinking. And I do quickly want to add here too that one of the very interesting points that Greg was making just a few moments ago was to emphasise the changing nature of the SBY government. And I was very conscious of that when I was writing my paper, that it's difficult to deal with that 10 years as a single whole, but I've had to do that. But we do need to bear in mind that the nature of the SBY regime did change. There were two SBY administrations, and that's important. But I'm making that point to emphasise that, particularly at the beginning of his incumbency, SBY, I think, was very motivated by the idea to restore stability after the trauma of the preceding years. So what was SBY's solution to his problem, or to his situation? And of course it was the Rainbow Cabinet. Now to me it's striking that despite these very new historical and political, or constitutional and political circumstances that SBY inherited, he used a strategy which was exactly the same as Wahid and Megawati, as his predecessors. He attempted to include all of the parties in cabinet. He gave the economic ministries mostly to technocrats, other ministries, the wet ministries mostly, to various representatives of political parties or people who had some connection with political parties. And he employed this same strategy across the entire length of his administration. Although, as I said, Greg emphasised the different nature of the first administration compared to the second administration. This strategy was an attempt to manage two relationships simultaneously. Firstly, the relationship with the cabinet, a way to manage the cabinet, while at the same time managing his relationships with the parliament. Having a large number of party representatives in the cabinet was supposed to buy him political support, or at least non-opposition, when he wanted to work with the parliament. And this is a quick diagram of one of SBY's cabinets. They didn't all look exactly like that, but that's pretty well what the balance of forces was. Now, did the strategy work? And I think the fairly clear answer is that it didn't. That it did not sustain either of the sets of relationships that he wanted to manage. It didn't sustain party loyalty in the cabinet. It didn't maintain or even gather support on a consistent basis within the parliament. And that was partly because it was conceptually flawed about the way the parliament worked. I don't want to linger on this too much. I've written about this before. But the idea that having parties that together had a majority of votes did not actually come to grips with the way in which the Indonesian parliament works. I really need to leave it at that because it's one of my interesting topics, well, topics that interest me, but it would take too long to go into very much detail. But it didn't work because the Indonesian parliament does not work on numbers in a way that is conventionally thought of other parliaments working. And it also failed as a tool for the management of cabinet and for developing an effective cabinet, because ministers largely viewed ministries as theirs. To obtain a seat was to obtain control over the resources of the ministry, the political capital, the patronage networks, rather than to enter into a decision-making body and into a united administration. The idea of cabinet solidarity just simply did not exist. So this did not ensure political cohesion nor political support, and it didn't promote decision-making or unified policy approaches. But we might ask the question, could the Rainbow Cabinet strategy have worked? And was it absolutely unworkable? Well, I think the key thing is looking back again at the personality or the way that SBY decided to manage that strategy. It was one that required a highly interventionist president. It required somebody who was prepared to exercise discipline over his cabinet ministers, to say no to his cabinet ministers, to say you should do this, and if they didn't, to sack them. None of that was done. And that's one of the consistent features, of course, of the SBY administration, the fact that he did not discipline members of the cabinet, and also, an important element, did not back up those members of the cabinet who did not have party political support when they came under pressure. And the classic example of that, of course, was Sri Mulyani. Also, there was a need to build processes for cabinet and ministerial coordination, mechanisms through which the different silos of the government with their respective dirgens controlling these resources were coordinated and forced to coordinate. All that was also required. And there needed to be systematic ways to maintain close relations with the parties in the DPR, but then also mechanisms for President DPR coordination. And Yusuf Wanandi, in an interesting Jakarta Post article in 2002, argued that there needed to be an office controlled by somebody who had a cabinet level position to build and maintain these relationships. And this comes back again to the issue that has been touched a lot on, whether or not SBY acted as a leader or a mediator. And I think it's fairly clear that he saw himself largely, or his actions seem to suggest that he saw himself as a mediator. And I won't dwell on that because there's not enough time. But I do want to go on to the question of whether or not SBY faced an obstructionist parliament. The beginning of this argument, which you often see in a lot of analysis and a lot of NGO commentary, and that's particularly where I'm perhaps directing my comments because I'm not really an academic. My interest in this comes as somebody who's a development consultant who engages with a lot of people, and I constantly hear this story about SBY's administration being obstructed by the Parliament. It always fails to meet its lawmaking targets in the National Legislation Program. This is usually the beginning of the critique of the DPR. Usually it's incompetence, the MPs are lazy, they don't come to meetings, all of this sort of line. Or a more darker analysis is that the DPR is the tool of or the location for all of the reactionary anti-reform forces. And all of that may be partly true in many, many individual instances. But I think that analysis ignores the fact that, starting from the most basics in the wording of the Constitution, legislation is a joint government parliamentary process. It is not something that the DPR can undertake by itself. The Constitution says there must be persetujuan bersama. Every decision is reached jointly between the government and the DPR. Also, the fact that most laws are drafted in government ministries. They're not drafted in the DPR. Even those instances of bills that have originated officially from the DPR are often drafted by outside elements, ex-members of the bureaucracy, academics, various other individuals. There's very few ideas are generated within the DPR, whether reactionary or progressive. And in fact, legislative outcomes represent the intersection of many, many different interests. And the Parliament is the location often where those interests fight it out. But in an institutional sense, we cannot talk about the DPR acting as a body, and certainly not having a consistent pattern of obstructionism. Because legislation passed through the DPR is not necessarily created by it. In the paper, I deal with a few examples of laws. I don't have time to discuss those any further. The main point that I draw out of those three instances, the civil service law, the law on intelligence, and also a group of laws around issues like trade and finance and so forth, is the continuing power of the bureaucracy. That the most powerful driving force in policy terms, in terms of the decisions, and about how they're integrated into legislation comes not from the Parliament, not from individual ministers or from the President's office during the SBY years, but from the bureaucracy. And the reality is that during most of these debates, I'm talking in very general terms here, but lack of time means that I have to, SBY in so many instances was a bystander rather than an active participant in really nitty-gritty policy debates. 1 minute. Whoa. Okay, well, I will move rapidly on to my final question. What is SBY's legacy in terms of managing institutional relationships? And I've concluded with a question mark, perhaps because I wanted to ask the question to you, a legacy of absence. We should not forget that the fact of SBY's incumbency at the very beginning was important in bringing about a peaceful transfer of power, and that trauma that the country had gone through and the way in which SBY brought stability, I think, was very, very important. But of course the problem was, what was the next step? What was he going to do with this newly stable polity? And we can conclude, I think, that his approach of inclusiveness, 100% inclusiveness, would not buy loyalty, nor would it buy governmental cohesion by itself. And it's interesting to see that one of the few things that Jacqui has said publicly about how he might structure his government is that he will not adopt the same sort of ideas. He won't try to sell or buy political loyalty by selling cabinet seats. Whether he keeps to that is another question. And I think we can see that one of the legacies of the SBY years is that the presidential-parliamentary relationship is still undefined and it's still dysfunctional. It's inherently difficult in a balance of power system, like that as Indonesia has now adopted, and therefore it's a task that a president has to see as a priority of his or her administration. Arguably, SBY sidestepped the task. He had very distant relations with the Parliament, especially during his second term, and did not pay any attention to building up mechanisms by which the coordination between the two branches of government could be achieved. Also important is the fact that SBY inherited a presidential office which was very, very weak in terms of its human resources and its procedures and its structures, and he appears to have done very little or made limited efforts to overcome those structural weaknesses. And very, very important is the continuing existence of the unchallenged power of the bureaucracy. The new civil service law is a very, very interesting development, but it has turned out to be a very watered-down document for what it might have been, but its regulations, implementing regulations, are still in the process of drafting, and it will be very, very interesting to see what Jacqui makes of that new civil service law. And I still don't think that the Indonesian political class, nor Indonesians generally, really understand the new type of presidential system that they were given by the MPR in the constitutional reforms. It's interesting that the constitutional reforms were not carried out by extensive public consultation. There was no referendum or anything. It was done within the closed doors of one committee of the MPR. And one of the results of that is that I do not yet think that the Indonesian political class fully appreciates what the challenges that they will face in coming years with maintaining the relationship between President and the Parliament. And the complaining that perhaps one gets, the condemnation that one hears of the Parliament always makes me respond, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. This is the way things are always going to be. Look to the experience that Obama has had over the last 5 years with the US Congress. That's the future of Indonesian politics. I'll end it at that.
I'm just going to read out Jacqui's thing for a few minutes as well. Yeah, just that. That's fine. So, yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. And we'll get to questions for Stephen in just a second. As I mentioned, Jacqui Baker, who was to speak on professionalisation without reform, to do with security sector reform under UDIONO, has just prepared a very concise 3-minute summary of her paper, which I'll now read out for everyone, and her full paper to come, of course, in the edited conference volume. But in her paper, Jacqui argued that SBA inherited numerous opportunities and challenges from what Metzner calls first-generation security sector reforms, implemented by the previous government. These first-generation reforms dismantled the old authoritarian system and built the foundations of a new security sector by dissolving ABRI, withdrawing the military from politics, and reaffirming the authority of the police in law enforcement and security management. It fell to Yudhoyono to implement important second-generation reforms, which, as Mietzner argues, would add democratic substance to Indonesia's new security institutions. But Jacqui argues that SBA has in many cases shied from his inherited challenges, such as tackling the inadequate oversight mechanisms that govern the police and the military, the continuation of the territorial command system as well. But similarly, he has openly squandered and in some cases outright circumvented, she says, opportunities to implement reform, such as sabotaging the government takeover of military businesses, and in the case of the police's off-budget economy, ignoring it completely. Indeed, despite exhortations that the police be a professional public service, Yudhoyono has simultaneously weakened the force through poor leadership choices, the absence of reform to woefully inadequate oversight and regulatory frameworks, and an unwillingness to tackle rampant corruption within the force, she says. Effectively, Yudhoyono leaves a security sector characterised by high levels of institutional autonomy on the part of the police and the military, and dependence on discretionary rule from the presidential office. This suggests, Jacqui argues, that far from a security sector reformer, as Yudhoyono was known in the early years of Indonesia's transition, SBA in fact holds deeply conservative views about the role of the military in national security and is cautious about supporting an independent and professional police force. And as I said, that's just a taste of Jacqui's paper, and the full one will be available to people in the fullness of time. I'll now head on to the Q&A session, and we've got an opportunity to ask a few questions of Stephen. I'd ask people asking questions to think of those in the audience who are live tweeting the conference, and remember they have only 140 characters to summarise your question, so the shorter you can make it, the easier their lives will be. So we'll maybe take 2 questions for a start, if anyone would like to ask a question. Up the back there, and we've got time for another question in the first round if there's someone else who would like to. Yeah, over the side.
Stephen, thanks very much for your presentation, really interesting. I was just interested to ask, you ended on a really bleak note about the outlook for President-Parliamentary relations going forward. Are there any areas that the Constitution provides to the President which would give him imperial powers, some way of reaching around the DPR and driving policy out of his own office? If you were to give advice to Jokowi about how to do that, is there any sort of ideas that you can contribute about how to get around those blockages?
I'd like to just go back to the question of leadership, which partially gets back to the last session. But Stephen, you asked the question whether he's a leader or a mediator. But then you went on to say that he's probably neither of those things. He's a bystander. In other words, he's not there. And the previous session, of course, talked about him being a procrastinator. In other words, he hasn't really tried to push, as the previous questioner has said, his will on the Parliament or necessarily on his cabinet. And I'd like you to expand a bit more on what capacity a new president has to do both of those things.
Well, I'm being asked to give advice to Jokowi. Now that's a daunting prospect. But if I understand the question correctly, and I did have a little bit of trouble hearing you, it was a question about how a new president might overcome the blockages to relationship with the DPR, if that's correct. Well, I would maybe answer that question in a way that I've attempted to do it in my paper on two levels. Firstly, at a political level, how to maintain a political relationship with the institution of Parliament or the parties within it, and then how that can be done in terms of the machinery of government, in an institutional way perhaps. And the first advice that I would give to Jokowi, and I think he seems to have taken it already, is that the attempt to buy political support through including everybody just simply doesn't work. And it's an interesting reflection, I think, on the way politics works itself out, sometimes through personalities, as we've talked about, that the strategy of opposition that PDIP adopted was to considerable extent the result of the personality of Megawati, that she was taking her bat and ball and going home and therefore keeping her party in opposition. But I think the reality is that PDIP has learnt a lesson out of that, that they emerged stronger out of being an opposition party rather than if they'd bought into this rather lacklustre government of SBY. So therefore I think the conclusion would be something, well, it's not a conclusion for Jacqui, but I would put it this way, that I think that there is potentially a healthy development emerging in Indonesian politics of the tradition of something of the beginnings of a tradition of government versus opposition developing, and that the experience of PDIP and Gerindra and so forth attached to them was that it's possible to successfully engage in political activity from opposition, that everybody doesn't need to be inside the tent. And if Jacqui can understand that, that will be, I think, extra fuel to the engine room of his decision-making, which would lead to the development of a cabinet which is based on a commitment of a group of parties to an agenda rather than to an across-the-board lowest common denominator and really an agreement without any prior commitments. So to build a cabinet based around clear set of priorities, I think, is probably what I'm working my way towards. And in institutional terms, as I've tried to suggest very briefly, one of the other absences in SBY's government was attention to building the machinery of government. One point that I didn't get to make was that when SBY had various things, various initiatives, the poverty initiative, the monitoring unit that he established, he had the strategy of establishing these special bodies, the Government Development Monitoring Body, I can't remember the actual term, the Poverty Reduction Unit, which were supposed to coordinate government. But in fact, all they did was replicate the structures of government. There was another structure alongside all of the existing silos. And when it came to the inevitable time when those units with supposedly a presidential authority behind them came up against the existing structures of government, SBY backed off. He failed to support the people who he should have been supporting because he was getting to Bob's question, a mediator. Rather than taking a side of people in these conflicts, he wanted to mediate between them, and the result was that nothing happened. So, to me, the really clear lesson about that is that the lack of institutionalisation in Indonesian government as a whole, the capacity of the silos or the sub-silos within government ministries controlled by different director generals is something that really has to be a priority for reform. So at a political level and an institutional level, there are things that he could do differently. SBY as a leader or a mediator, I didn't really mean to conclude that he was neither in what I said. My use of the term bystander was talking specifically about the way he acted in those cases of particular pieces of legislation, and then also in relation to issues like Ahmadiyya, the labour law that somebody did mention earlier on. Rather than actively intervening, he let the various interest groups fight it out, and only in very limited instances did he actually intervene. In the case of the civil service law, so the story goes, SBY only intervened in the fight between the bureaucracy and the reformers, if I can put it that way rather crudely, in the debates within the DPR was that when he was embarrassed and somebody wrote an article in the media saying SBY is doing nothing about this, calling on SBY to act, SBY's response was, goodness me, I didn't know anything, this was happening, and then he intervened. So the story goes, from reliable sources. So that I would see as an example of his tendency to want to mediate between the existing players rather than to move out himself and to set some sort of leadership position.
So we've got time just for one quick question and equally quick answer, if someone else would like to, just right up the back there. Got the microphone.
So my name is Wahyu Sudiono, teaching at University of Canberra. Thank you, Stephen, for interesting presentation. Thanks also for mentioning about civil service law. Civil service reform is my research area, and I would like to ask further about you mentioning about your doubt that Jokowi might not be able to continue on into embracing in implementation of civil service law. The way I saw it is that Jokowi was actually quite committed even during the drafting of the civil service law. For example, he embraced the open selection methods proposed by the civil service law in his Camat and so on. And now actually he is expanding this notion of open recruitment within for his cabinet, for his coming cabinet.
Just have to wind that question up as we have to move the conference along.
So I'm just wondering how you would explain whether he's backtracking or might be, progressing with this. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for that question. It's an opportunity for me to clarify. If I gave the impression that I thought Jokowi was backing off on civil service reform, I certainly did not want to give that impression. In fact, I'm quite excited about the fact that that law has just been passed and that Jokowi is coming into power as president, and probably the number one thing on his political profile, his political reputation, is the fact that he's willing to take on the bureaucracy. So I think it's actually a wonderful potential time for civil service reform now. And the second point about that is that thank goodness that the process was so slow, because the implementing regulations have not yet been completed. Had they been completed already, that they might have entrenched a lot of vested interest, and we might have ended up with an effective version of that law, which was very, very weak. But because, as you know, the devil is in the detail, is always in legislation in Indonesia, in the implementing regulations. And the opportunity there is still there to influence the way in which that law is interpreted and implemented through the implementing regulations. And Jokowi, I think, has a fantastic opportunity, and I think he's likely to take it, not back off from it.
Well, if I could ask everyone to thank Stephen for a wonderful presentation and answers.